When I think back about my childhood and my early teenage years, I see it all in black and white on a flat screen, like the movies and the TV of the time. This was the 50s and early 60s. I lived in a row house in Philadelphia in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And all my friends lived in a row house in Philadelphia in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And all my relatives lived in a row house in Philadelphia in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And that was life. It was all very ordinary, but there was one exception. That was my Aunt Chalka. Chalka lived in Flushing, New York in a detached home. There were no other homes attached to it on either side. I didn't know anybody else like that. It even had a porch, a screen porch around two sides, and it had an attic where the housekeeper lived. She had a live-in housekeeper. And I loved to go there. I got to spend a lot of time with her in the summertime. I might spend weeks up in Flushing, New York with her, and she was old enough to be my grandmother. I loved her. She would give me books to read, and she would say, "Here, read this, but don't tell your mother I gave you that. Here, read this, but don't tell your mother I gave it to you." And so, of course, I'd read, avidly looking for the dirty parts, and I never found any dirty parts. As I think back now, I realize that this was an indication of my aunt's devious mind. She knew if she told me not to tell my mother that I would read it, and it was, it was stuff like Guy de Maupassant, Somerset Maugham, Damon Runyon. It was good stuff. But she got me to read it. Now, when you walked into her home, you were overwhelmed by two smells. They were wonderful smells. One was the rich, deep smell of her imported Egyptian cigarettes. The brand was called Helmar, unfiltered of course, and she smoked 4 packs a day. And you were overwhelmed by the smell of fresh brewed coffee. There was always a pot of coffee, 24/7, no matter what age you were. And the rule was if you were the last person to drink a cup, you made the next pot. And it was there all day long, and I'm convinced that it stunted my growth. You see, the truth is I'm not really overweight. I'm 8 inches too short. And nobody put together at that time, that was the 50s, we weren't that bright, we didn't put together the coffee and her insomnia. But basically, my Aunt Chalka never slept. She would stay up all night watching old movies on television, and I got to stay up with her and drink coffee and watch old movies. And she knew every one. She'd seen it time and time again, and she'd say things like, "Shah, Shah, now's the part where he kisses her. Shah, Shah, now's the part where they find the murderer." But you weren't allowed to talk, even though she knew them all by heart. And if you were lucky, during the commercial, she'd be in the mood, she'd go into the kitchen, just take a look at what was lying around and make up some bolinces or kugel or whatever, and she'd come back with the plate, and everybody'd be happy. Then around daybreak, she'd go to her room, and I'd hear her pacing back and forth in those old lady shoes on the wooden floor, and around noon, she'd be up again. Now, what was really interesting about the household was what happened after dinner. Because about 7:30 every night, the doorbell started ringing, and these very strange women started walking in the door. Some of them had tics. They were all extremely serious. There was no, "Oh, hello, little boy." I mean, none of that. They went straight for the dining room. And they sat around the dining room table. These were compulsive gamblers, and they were there for their nightly poker game. And that's how my aunt supported herself, where the inevitable outcome of her devious mind was she was a great poker player. And she got a little bit for hosting, but she played every night too, and she must have been winning to afford the nice house and the housekeeper and the 4 packs a day of Helmar cigarettes. Now, these women, well, they tended to come in, it was summer, they would sit around the dining room table, and many of them would take their blouses off. And even as a budding young man, it was not a pretty sight. And they played poker on this oilcloth tablecloth with, my aunt had the most amazing set of poker chips. They were solid ivory, totally smooth, no ridges or anything. They just felt wonderful in your hand. And I had two jobs during the poker games. One was to keep the cats out of the dining room, because apparently weird women with tics who are compulsive gamblers and nervous hate it when the cats run under their chairs. And the second thing was, if the doorbell rang, I was supposed to look out the window before answering, because if it was the cops, I had to warn them. Apparently they had been raided a couple of times and all taken away in a paddy wagon. It's one of my great disappointments is I never got to see that. That would have been cool. But it was cool being able to tell my friends that, that I had an aunt who supported herself by running a poker game. So as I got a little older and I learned to drive, and the 60s came, and I was busy marching in protests and trying to get laid, and I didn't visit the family as much anymore. And I didn't see her for a while, and then when she died, I didn't get to her funeral. But my brother told me after the funeral that one of her sons called him aside and said, "Hey, look, everybody wanted her poker chips. Everybody in the world wants those poker chips. But I screwed them all. I buried them with her. I put them in her casket." So if it was cool having an aunt who supported herself with a poker game, it was even cooler having an aunt who was buried with her poker chips. Now, a few years ago, I went online to Ancestry.com, and I started building my family tree, not really aware of all the things that could happen from that, but I started to make connections. Other people do research, and they reach out to you, and you reach out to them, and one thing happens, another thing happens, and I started discovering relatives I didn't know I had, and making connections with relatives I hadn't seen in 40 years. And one of those relatives that I made a connection with was Chalka's granddaughter. Now, this last Hanukkah, the day that Hanukkah was about to begin that night, a box was delivered to my office. And it was, about this size, and the weird thing about it is it had, for return address, all it had was an address and a zip code. No name, no city. And you open the box, and inside there's a card with 3 cats on the front. And inside it says, "Don't believe everything you hear, signed A cousin." And then there's a lot of paper in the box. And underneath all that paper is a box of Scotch tape. Scotch magic tape. Why is somebody sending me a box of Scotch tape? Well, one of my co-workers looked up the zip code and found that it was Saddle Ridge, New Jersey, which is where my cousin Jeannie lives, Chalka's granddaughter. And she lives in the house that she inherited from her father, Chalka's son. And so I knew it must have been from her, but I have no idea why. Is this supposed to represent some kind of family rift that we have to tape up? Is the word magic the point? I just don't get it. So I called her up, and I said, I got this box, and it must be from you, but I don't get it. And she said, "You don't get it?" I said, "No, I don't get it." She said, "Well, look in the box." I said, "I did. There's just a box of Scotch tape in there." She said, No, look inside the box of Scotch tape." I didn't need Scotch tape, so I hadn't opened it. But when I did, I found one blue solid ivory poker chip. So the meaning of this, the story behind this is there are two ways to think about it. There's the rational way to think about this, and that's that her father wanted the poker chips himself. And he didn't want anybody to bug him, so he created the myth that he had buried his mother with her poker chips so that he could keep them in a closet, and his daughter eventually found them there in the closet and sent one to me. I prefer a different way of looking at it. And that's that my devious, sly aunt with the impish grin sent me a Hanukkah present from the grave.